The candles in the east corridor had burned low by the time Ilara pressed herself against the cold stone wall and stopped breathing. She had not meant to linger. She had only come to return the embroidery hoop she had borrowed from Lady Marin's chamber. A small favor, a small errand, the kind of invisible task that filled her days as the Duke's ward and unofficial seamstress, the girl who existed somewhere between servant and guest, valued by no one and noticed only when something was needed. The corridor connected the Duke's private study to the wing where the household staff slept, and at this hour it should have been empty. It was never supposed to have voices in it, but it did, 2 of them. She recognized the first immediately, Duke Aldrich Voss, her guardian of 6 years, the man who had taken her in after her father's death with great ceremony and greater coldness. His voice was deep and deliberate, each word placed like a stone in a wall. The second voice she recognized after a moment's confusion, Lord Fenwick Calder, the Duke's closest adviser and the man who handled every arrangement that the Duke wished not to touch directly with his own hands. The contract must be signed before the month ends. Aldrich was saying, "Calder, I am not asking you whether it can be done. I am telling you it will be done." "The girl will ask questions," Calder said. There was a wet, cautious quality to his voice that had always unsettled Ilara. "She is not entirely without wit. Then she will ask questions to an empty house. By the time she understands what has happened, she will be on her way to the Mervane estate, and I will have her signature on 3 documents she will believe concern her annual allowance." Ilara's grip tightened around the embroidery hoop. The carved wood pressed into her palm like a brand. "You are certain the Mervane heir will accept?" Calder asked. "I am certain of nothing regarding that boy except his greed, which is consistent and reliable. His family's land borders my northern holdings. The marriage gives him access to the river trade and gives me a clear path through the Voss Pass without toll negotiation. Ilara is simply the currency in the exchange." A pause. The sound of liquid being poured, wine or brandy, some comfortable indulgence taken in the dark, while her future was decided by men who had never once asked her what she wanted. "She will make the journey next week. I will tell her it is a social call. Lady Mervane has requested her presence. By the time she arrives, the engagement will already be announced in the capital. And if she refuses once she understands, she is my ward." The Duke's voice was utterly flat. "She has no money of her own, no property, no legal standing that does not flow through my name. Her refusal is a social curiosity, nothing more. The documents will be signed. The marriage will occur. I will be done with the obligation her father put upon me 6 years ago when he had the poor judgment to die indebted." The footsteps began moving. Ilara slid further into the shadow of an alcove. Her back pressed against a cold tapestry of a hunting scene, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain they would hear it. They did not. Aldrich passed within 4 feet of her, his torch held ahead of him, Calder a step behind, and neither of them glanced to the side. They moved like men who had never needed to worry about being overheard. She waited until their footsteps faded. Then she waited longer. Then she stood in the dark corridor with her embroidery hoop clutched to her chest and understood, with a cold and thorough clarity, that she had perhaps 1 week to save herself. Name Mervane she knew. The heir, Castor Mervane, was 20 years her senior, red-faced, loud, and notorious in the 3 nearest counties for the treatment of his horses, his servants, and his 2 previous wives, both of whom had died in circumstances that generated whispers but never formal inquiries. Ilara had met him once at a winter assembly when she was 15. He had looked at her the way a farmer looks at a fence post, assessing its usefulness, indifferent to its preferences. She had spent the past 4 years quietly understanding that her situation in the Voss household was precarious. She had spent the past 2 years doing something about it. Now she found out she had perhaps not done enough, or perhaps she had done exactly enough, but the timing would be everything. She walked back to her room and did not sleep. By morning she had a plan. The first thing she did was visit the household steward, a meticulous and slightly mournful man named Tobias Grent, who had managed the Voss estate accounts for 30 years and had, on 3 separate occasions, quietly corrected errors in Ilara's allowance calculations in her favor without ever explaining why. She had never been certain whether this was kindness or carelessness, but she had kept careful note of it. She found him in his counting room before breakfast, surrounded by ledgers. "Mr. Grant," she said, closing the door behind her, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." He looked up over his spectacles. He had the face of a man who had decided very early in life that honesty was simply easier to maintain than its alternative. "Miss Ilara, is it true that my father left a property in the eastern county in trust for me? Not the money, I know about the money, or the lack of it, but the Thornfield cottage and the land attached to it." A very long pause. Tobias set down his pen. "Where did you hear about Thornfield?" "My father's lawyer wrote to me 2 years ago. I believe you may have intercepted the letter, or it may have been redirected. I only found out because the lawyer wrote again, to a different address I had arranged through a friend." She kept her voice steady. She had rehearsed this. "I am not accusing you of anything, Mr. Grant. I am asking whether it is in the estate records." Tobias looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man doing rapid calculations that had nothing to do with numbers. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk, removed a thin folder, and placed it on the table between them. "Thornfield Cottage and its 40 acres were placed in trust by your father before his death." He said quietly, "The trust was structured so that it passes to you on your 22nd birthday or on the occasion of your marriage, whichever comes first. The Duke is aware of its existence. He has been managing it on your behalf, as he is legally permitted to do until the trust matures." A pause. "Your 22nd birthday is in 4 months, and the Duke's plan to marry me to Castor Mervane before then." The folder sat between them. Neither of them looked at it. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Tobias said, in the tone of a man who knew everything about that. "Cottage," Ilara said. "Is it currently occupied? A tenant farmer and his family. They pay a modest rent. Is the rent paid to the Duke or held in the trust?" Another pause. Tobias picked up his pen, then set it down again. "The trust," he said, "which is why the Duke cannot directly access it. How much has accumulated?" He told her. It was not a fortune. It was, however, enough to live on for a year, enough to travel, enough to hire a lawyer and file the documents that would, if her father's lawyer had explained the structure correctly, give her the right to claim the property directly in cases of trustee misconduct. "The Duke was planning to have me sign documents this week," she said. "Documents I would believe concerned my allowance." Tobias said nothing, but he did not look away. "If I sign them before understanding what they were," she said, "could they be used to waive my right to the trust property?" "Such documents would not be legally enforceable," Tobias said carefully, "particularly if it could be demonstrated that the signatory was not informed of their true nature. But it would cause delay, legal dispute, time during which I might already be married." "Yes," he said, "that is, I would imagine, the point." She looked at him, he looked at her. The counting room was very quiet. "Mr. Grant," she said, "I am going to ask you to do something. Not for me. I understand you work for the Duke, and that is not a small thing. I am going to ask you to do it because you corrected my allowance calculations 3 times without being asked, and because I think you are a man who has spent 30 years watching a particular kind of arrangement and has perhaps grown tired of it. What is it you're asking? I need a copy of the trust documents. And I need to know whether Lord Calder has any standing to serve as a legal witness to contracts on the Duke's behalf. A very long pause. Then Tobias Grant opened a second drawer. She spent the afternoon writing 3 letters. The first was to her father's lawyer, a man named Aldous Cray, who practiced in the city of Vernon, 2 days' ride away. She told him what she had overheard, what she had learned from Tobias, and what she needed. A formal declaration of the trust structure, filed with the City Records Office, that would establish her rights beyond any document the Duke might produce. She told him to expect a second letter with instructions for next steps, and that if he did not hear from her within 10 days, he should proceed on his own judgment and understand that whatever had prevented her from writing was not her own choice. The second letter was to a woman named Dora Ashwell, who had been her closest friend before circumstances had carried them in different directions, who now lived in Vernon and who had once offered Elara a place to stay if she ever needed one. Elara had not taken her up on the offer at the time, believing the situation was manageable. She took her up on it now. The third letter was the one that required the most care. It was addressed to Lord Fenwick Calder. She had thought carefully about Calder. He was not a good man, but he was a practical one, and the two things are different in ways that matter enormously when you need something. He had been the Duke's instrument for years, but instruments have their own interests, and she had spent 6 years observing the household with the particular attention of someone who has nothing else to do and every reason to notice things. What she had noticed about Calder was this: he was careful. He documented everything. He kept copies of documents that implicated him in things the Duke had arranged, not out of sentiment but out of insurance. He had a modest property in the south and a daughter he intended to marry well, and his standing depended on the Duke, but also on his own reputation as a man of reliable judgment. She wrote him a letter that said, without saying it directly, that she was aware of the plan, that she was not without resources, and that the manner in which this situation resolved would have a direct bearing on whether certain details about his role in the arrangement became known to the parties in Vernon who might find them interesting. She did not threaten him. She invited him to consider his position carefully. She mentioned with apparent casualness that she had already been in contact with her father's lawyer, and that the trust documents had been filed that morning. They had not, of course, been filed that morning, but he did not know that, and the letter would reach him before he could confirm it. She gave all 3 letters to the stable boy who made the twice-weekly supply run to the village, along with enough coin to cover the cost of the city post, and she went to dinner. The Duke was in good spirits at dinner. He spoke about the northern holdings, about a dispute with a neighboring estate that he expected to resolve favorably, about the excellence of the pheasant. He looked at Elara once and said she was looking pale, and she said she had not slept well, which was true, and he nodded with the benign indifference of a man who considers himself in complete control of a situation. She watched him and felt something shift inside her, not anger exactly, which she had long since exhausted, but a kind of cold resolve that she recognized as the most useful emotion she had ever developed. Her father had taught her, without meaning to, by example, that hoping people will be better than they are is a form of preparation for nothing, that the world arranges itself according to power, and power can be built from almost anything, provided you start before the moment when you need it. She had started 2 years ago. She had started because she had, on a different evening, overheard a different conversation, not about her future specifically, but about her father's debts and the Duke's convenient acquisition of the estate that should by rights have passed to her, and had understood that waiting to be treated fairly was the same as deciding not to be treated fairly at all. Thornfield Cottage, 40 acres, a patient lawyer in Vernon, a friend with a spare room, 3 years of embroidery work sold quietly through a merchant she had befriended on a rare trip to the village, the money kept not in her room but with Dora, who kept it in a tin under her floorboards, not a fortune enough. She excused herself from dinner early, citing her poor sleep, and the Duke waved her away. In her room she packed a small bag, not the large trunk, which would be noticed. A traveling bag, the kind a person might carry for a day visit, light enough to walk with. She packed what she valued: her father's letters, the embroidery patterns she had designed herself and which had some small commercial value, the copy of the trust documents that Tobias had left folded inside a ledger he happened to leave outside her door that afternoon, and 3 changes of clothing. She set the bag under her bed and lay down in her clothes and waited for 4 in morning. The household sounds died down after midnight. The last servant went to bed at 12:30. The Duke's study light, visible from her window across the courtyard, went out at 1. She had learned over 6 years the rhythm of this house as a prisoner learns the rhythm of their cell, not with resignation but with purpose. At 4 she rose, took her bag and walked out. She did not go through the front door, which was bolted and would wake the porter. She went through the kitchen garden, through the gate that was secured with a latch that had never worked correctly, and that she had been meaning to report to the groundskeeper for 3 years and had not, for reasons that now seemed quite prescient. She walked through the kitchen garden and across the meadow behind it in the dark, following the path toward the village that she had walked dozens of times in daylight, and that she now walked by feel and by the pale suggestion of starlight through the clouds. She was a mile from the estate when she heard hoofbeats behind her and understood, with a lurch of cold fear, that she had been discovered far sooner than she had anticipated. She stepped off the path and stood still in the long grass and waited. The horse slowed. A voice said quietly, "Miss Elara." She exhaled. It was Tobias Grent, riding a plain brown horse and wearing a traveling coat over his usual steward's clothes, a lantern hooded to its lowest setting in his hand. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "No," he agreed. "I brought you your money." He handed down a small leather pouch. She stared at it. "The merchant in the village," he said. "He had your earnings from the past 6 months. I went to him yesterday afternoon. He said to tell you the blue silk pattern sold particularly well." She could not speak for a moment. Then she said, "This will implicate you. I am 61 years old." Tobias Grant said pleasantly, "And I am extremely tired of my current employment. I have a sister in Vernon. I have been planning to retire for 2 years. I had simply not yet found the right occasion." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "I've also written a statement, sworn, signed, witnessed last night by the miller, who is a notary, documenting the trust arrangement, the documents you were intended to sign, and the nature of the plan as I understood it. You will find it useful if the Duke attempts any legal action." "He will," she said. "He will find it difficult." Tobias said, "Given that I have also deposited with the City Records Office in Vernon by fast rider yesterday afternoon a copy of your father's original trust instrument and a letter from myself explaining the circumstances of its management." He paused. "Your lawyer, Mr. Cray, has already been notified. He replied this morning before I left. He is expecting you." Elara stood in the dark meadow with the leather pouch in one hand and the envelope in the other, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been braced tight for so long. She had forgotten it was there. "Why?" she said, not ungratefully, just needing to know. The old man was quiet for a moment. His horse shifted its weight. The lantern cast a small amber circle on the grass. "Your father was a decent man," he said finally. "He made poor financial decisions and trusted people he should not have trusted. But he was decent. And you have his eyes and rather more of his practical sense than he himself possessed, which I consider a mercy." He straightened in the saddle. "I watched the Duke take what was yours for 6 years and tell himself he was doing you a charity. I wrote it in ledgers I was not proud of. A man only has so many ledgers left in him." She nodded. There was nothing adequate to say to that, so she said only, "Thank you, Mr. Grant, Tobias," he said. "We are both, I think, done with the formalities of that household." She walked the remaining miles to the village alone in the dark, and at sunrise she was on the mail coach to Vernon, and by afternoon she was sitting in Dora Ashwell's kitchen drinking tea and crying, which she had not allowed herself to do once in the previous 24 hours, and which felt now entirely appropriate. Dora held her hand and did not ask many questions, which was why Elara had always liked her. The legal proceedings took 2 months. The Duke's initial response was rage, a series of letters to her lawyer that Aldous Cray described, with professional restraint, as strongly worded. Then the letters shifted to negotiation, which told her that Cray's filing had done what she had hoped it would do, which was to make the situation public enough that the Duke's preferred resolution, quiet erasure, was no longer available. Calder's response to her letter, which arrived at Dora's house 9 days after she had left the estate, was 3 paragraphs of carefully worded neutrality that amounted, when translated from the language of legal caution, to "I will not act against you." She had not expected active support. Neutrality was sufficient. Lord Fenwick Calder, she later learned, left the Duke's employment before the month was out, citing a wish to spend more time attending to his own affairs. The Duke sent him 2 more letters, which Calder did not answer. The timing told its own story. The trust property was formally declared hers on the 3rd of following month, a date that happened to fall 1 week before her 22nd birthday, and which Aldous Cray had, with some professional ingenuity, arranged by citing the documented evidence of trustee misconduct. Thornfield Cottage was hers, the accumulated rent was hers, the 40 acres, the tenant farmer, the modest but solid fact of an independent existence, hers. She went to see it for the first time on a cold, bright morning in early autumn. The cottage was smaller than she had imagined, with a sagging porch and a garden that had been allowed to become enthusiastic in its own direction, and the view from the back was of a long field running down to a line of birch trees, and then beyond that, somewhere behind the trees, the river. She stood in the garden for a long time. The tenant farmer's wife brought her a cup of tea and watched her from a cautious distance, unsure whether the new landowner would be better or worse than the old arrangement, which is a reasonable question to have. Elara drank the tea and looked at the field and the birch trees and thought about everything she would need to learn: farming, land management, the maintenance of a stone house that had been somewhat neglected, the keeping of accounts in her own name, for her own purposes, answerable to no one else's judgment about what she was worth or who she should be. It was a great deal to learn. She had always been good at learning things. She had, over the course of 6 years in the Duke's household, taught herself embroidery, household management, basic accounting, the structure of inheritance law, the geography of 2 counties, the schedule of the mail coaches, and the particular art of being invisible in a house where invisibility was the condition of survival. She could, she thought, manage a field and a cottage. She could manage considerably more than that, in time. Duke Aldrich Voss sent one final letter, in November, that arrived via the formal post, and had the quality of a document written under legal advice, careful, bloodless, offering a settlement figure for the costs of her upkeep during her years as his ward that implied she owed him something. She passed it to Aldous Cray without opening it fully, having read the first paragraph and understood its nature. Cray responded on her behalf. The response was brief. The Duke did not write again. Elara heard the following spring that he had arranged a different alliance for the northern holdings, a straight forward land purchase without any human currency involved, which suggested that the failure of the Mervane arrangement had cost him more than he liked, and that he had drawn the appropriate lesson. She did not know whether to feel satisfied by this or simply indifferent to it. She found, on reflection, that she was mostly indifferent. She had spent enough of her life paying attention to what he wanted. She had better uses for her attention now. Tobias Grant settled in Vernon with his sister. He sent her a short note at Christmas, the first of what became an annual habit, brief and practical in tone, reporting on his health and occasionally asking after the cottage in a way that suggested he felt some proprietary interest in its welfare. She wrote back in the same register. It was a correspondence she valued. The tenant farmer's wife, whose name was Nell, taught her to make preserves. Elara taught Nell's eldest daughter to read. Dora Ashwell visited in summer and stayed for 3 weeks, and they talked for long evenings about things that had nothing to do with estates or guardians or the legal definitions of a ward's personhood, which was the most restful conversation Elara had had in years. She sold 2 embroidery patterns to a merchant in Vernon who distributed them to shops in the capital, and with the money she repaired the cottage porch. She negotiated a slightly better arrangement with the tenant farmer, who appreciated the directness of conversation and the fact that she had clearly read the original tenancy terms in full before arriving. She kept accounts in a leather book she bought herself and wrote in her own hand, and the numbers in it were hers and no one else's to look at or adjust or quietly revise for someone else's benefit. It was a life that required considerably more work than her years in the Duke's household, where she had at least been kept in comfort if not in dignity. It was also a life in which she woke each morning with the specific satisfaction of knowing that every decision of the day, small or large, would be her own. She thought sometimes about the corridor, the candles burning low, the embroidery hoop in her hands, and the 2 voices explaining her future to each other with the casual thoroughness of men who had never considered that she might hear them, might understand them, might have already been preparing for something very like this moment for 2 years. It was, she thought, the best gift the Duke had ever inadvertently given her, not the cottage, she had been building toward that herself, but the hearing of it, the removal of the last possible argument for patience, for giving the situation more time, for hoping that things would resolve themselves without her having to act. She had needed to hear him say it, not because she had not known, somewhere beneath charitable interpretation she had tried to give his behavior, but because knowing it in that complete and undeniable way had burned away the last of her hesitation like a candle burning down to its socket. She had spent the night after hearing it planning. She had spent the following day executing the plan. By morning of the day after that she had been on a mail coach in the thin early light, watching the countryside open out ahead of her, with a leather bag and a pouch of coins and a set of documents, and the slowly solidifying understanding that she had, against considerable odds, gotten out. The plan, she supposed, had never really been his to own. He had only provided the occasion for it. She closed the leather account book for the evening and set it on the shelf beside her father's letters. Outside, the birch trees were silver in the last of the autumn light. The field ran long and quiet down to the tree line, and the river was somewhere beyond it, and the whole of it was hers. She put on her coat and went outside and stood in the garden until the light failed entirely, which was one of her great luxuries now, the standing still in the evening, in a place that was hers, accountable to no one's schedule but the sun's. Then she went inside, lit her own candle, and began the next thing,